August 7th, 1942. 06:41 hours, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Through the humid morning mist rising from Lunga Point, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki lowered his binoculars with barely concealed contempt. Across the beach, American Marines were wading ashore in chaotic clusters, their landing craft scattered along the shoreline like children's toys abandoned in haste. "Fools," he muttered to his adjutant, Captain Yoshio Nakagawa. "They bunched together like frightened cattle. No discipline, no understanding of jungle warfare." Nakagawa nodded, studying the American formations through his own field glasses. The Marines moved with obvious uncertainty, weighed down by equipment that seemed absurdly excessive for tropical warfare. They carried what appeared to be enough supplies to invade a continent, not a small island in the Solomons. "Sir, intelligence reports indicate most of these men have never seen combat, fresh conscripts from farms and cities." Ichiki's laugh was cold and sharp. "And they think to face the Imperial Army? Men who have conquered China, Singapore, the Philippines?" He gestured toward the jungle behind them, dark and impenetrable, pressing against the narrow coastal strip like a living wall. "That forest will devour them. The jungle is our ally. It has always been Japan's weapon against soft, industrialized nations. They will learn what their fathers learned in 1905. Japan cannot be defeated." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Colonel Ichiki didn't know, what none of the 2,000 veteran Japanese soldiers scattered across Guadalcanal could have imagined, was that he was witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare that would systematically destroy Japan's military doctrine. These frightened cattle were the 1st Marine Division, and they were about to introduce the Imperial Army to something it had never encountered: American island warfare. The concept seemed absurd on paper. The United States Marine Corps had spent decades preparing for a war that military experts claimed would never happen: amphibious assaults against fortified positions in the Pacific. While European armies focused on mechanized warfare across open terrain, the Marines had studied something far more specific: how to take islands from a determined enemy who had every advantage. The training had been brutal and unconventional. At New River, North Carolina, and Camp Lejeune, Marines had practiced amphibious landings until they could execute them in their sleep. They'd learned to live in swamps that mimicked tropical conditions. They'd developed new tactics for jungle fighting that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Most importantly, they'd been taught to operate in small, independent units when communications broke down, and communications always broke down in the jungle. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had watched his men train for 18 months. Unlike the Japanese, who believed spirit and experience would overcome any obstacle, Vandegrift understood that jungle warfare required specific preparation. "The jungle doesn't care about your courage," he'd told his officers before embarkation. "It doesn't care about your training in China or your victories in the Philippines. It's neutral, but we've learned to make it our weapon." The landing at Guadalcanal was the first test of this doctrine, and initially it appeared to confirm Japanese contempt. Marines stumbled through knee-deep mud, struggling with equipment loads that exceeded 80 pounds per man. They hacked through undergrowth with machetes, making noise that could be heard for hundreds of yards. They bunched up at obstacles, creating perfect targets for any defender with proper fire discipline. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, landing with the 5th Marines, later described the chaos. "We didn't look like warriors. We looked like pack mules that had lost their way. Every man carried a rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tools, gas masks, and God knows what else. We couldn't move quietly. We couldn't move fast. We looked exactly like what the Japanese expected, soft Americans who didn't belong in their ocean. The Japanese defenders, members of the Special Naval Landing Force and construction troops, watched the American advance with satisfaction. These weren't the hardened warriors who had stopped the Japanese advance at China's gates for years. These were children playing at war, and the jungle would teach them the price of their arrogance. But something strange began happening in those first hours that Japanese observers couldn't quite comprehend. When Marines encountered resistance, they didn't retreat or panic. Instead, they did something unexpected. They stopped, organized into small teams, and methodically eliminated the threat using coordinated fire and movement. When communication lines were cut, as they always were in the jungle, units continued operating independently, following prearranged plans without waiting for orders. Lieutenant Nakamoto Tadashi, commanding a forward observation post, radioed back to his battalion command with confusion rather than confidence. The Americans fight strangely. They do not mass for banzai charges. They advance in small groups, covering each other. When we ambush them, they do not break. They adapt. His report was dismissed. One day's observation meant nothing against centuries of Japanese military tradition. The Americans were soft, undisciplined, and they would learn. On August 20th, 1942, Colonel Ichiki prepared to teach them that lesson. His 916 elite troops, veterans of campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, would execute a night bayonet charge that would drive the Americans into the sea. The plan was simple, proven, and according to every principle of Japanese military doctrine, unstoppable. Superior spirit and determination would overcome material advantage. The warrior's soul would defeat the merchant's gold. At 03:10 hours, Ichiki's 800 soldiers moved silently through the jungle toward the American positions along the Ilu River. Every man was a veteran. Every soldier had killed in close combat. They carried the arrogance of an army that had never known defeat in the Pacific. They were about to discover what American island warfare really meant.
The first wave of Ichiki's assault hit the Marine positions at 03:31 hours with the force of a tsunami. Screaming warriors emerged from the darkness, bayonets glinting in the tropical moonlight, confident that shock and steel would shatter the American line as it had shattered Chinese, British, and Filipino defenders before. What happened in the next 7 minutes would be studied in military academies for the next 80 years. The Marines didn't break. They didn't panic. They didn't even seem particularly surprised. Instead, they executed a response so methodically devastating that Japanese survivors would describe it as mechanical, inhuman, impossible. Interlocking fields of fire, a concept the Marines had practiced until it became instinctive, transformed the riverbank into a killing ground. Every position had been sighted during daylight, every field of fire measured and registered. Machine gun teams had spent days mapping dead space and marking range cards. Now, in total darkness, that preparation paid its bloody dividend. Private Robert Leckie, manning a .30 caliber machine gun in the center of the line, later recalled, "They came screaming out of the jungle like they expected us to run. We didn't run. We just started working. That's what it felt like. Work. Traverse left, fire. Traverse right, fire. Reload, check barrel temperature. Traverse, fire." It wasn't personal. It wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. The Japanese assault doctrine, perfected against opponents who broke under psychological pressure, had encountered an enemy who responded to psychological warfare with industrial violence. Where Bushido demanded courage unto death, American doctrine demanded efficiency unto victory. The cultural collision was absolute. Within minutes, over 200 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying on the sandbar. The attack hadn't just failed. It had been annihilated with such completeness that survivors couldn't comprehend what had happened. Colonel Ichiki, watching his elite troops disappear into intersecting fire lanes like morning mist, understood in those moments that everything Japanese military theory had taught him about American weakness was catastrophically wrong. But the real lesson, the moment that would transform Japanese confidence into creeping terror, came at dawn when Marine commanders executed the counterattack. Rather than simply defending and declaring victory, the Marines did something the Japanese had never experienced from Western forces. They hunted. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion 1st Marines crossed the Ilu River upstream and moved through the jungle with a precision that shocked Japanese observers. These weren't the clumsy, noisy Americans of 2 weeks ago. These were predators who had learned the jungle's language. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The envelopment was textbook, except the textbook had been written in the last 14 days through brutal trial and error. Marine units moved through supposedly impossible terrain, coordinated without radio communication, and executed a double envelopment that trapped Ichiki's remaining forces against the sea. What happened wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The Marines had brought forward light tanks, Stuart M3s the Japanese intelligence had assured command could never operate in jungle terrain. The tanks crushed fleeing Japanese soldiers beneath their treads, their machine guns methodically finishing wounded enemies who refused surrender. Sergeant Mitchell Page, observing the aftermath, felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, but cold recognition. That's when I understood. This wasn't about courage or cowardice. It was about method. We'd developed a method for killing that was more efficient than their method, and we'd keep refining it until we perfected it. Of Ichiki's 916 elite troops, only 128 escaped into the jungle. The colonel himself, unable to accept the impossibility of what had happened, committed ritual suicide on the beach, his sword laying beside him as Marine patrols moved past without pause. His death wasn't honored by his enemies. It was barely noticed. The Americans were already adapting, learning, preparing for the next engagement. The Battle of the Ilu River should have been a warning to Imperial headquarters. Instead, Japanese command dismissed it as a fluke, bad luck, perhaps poor leadership. They sent reinforcements, the Sendai Division, 20,000 veteran troops who would show these Americans what real warriors could accomplish. The Sendai Division's commander, Lieutenant General Haruki Hyakutake, studied the reports from Guadalcanal with growing concern but ultimate confidence. Yes, the Americans had stopped Ichiki's assault, but Ichiki had been reckless, attacking with insufficient force. A proper offensive, with proper numbers, following proper doctrine, would succeed. What Harakuchi couldn't see, what no Japanese commander could see from their perspective of cultural and military superiority, was that the Americans weren't just fighting, they were iterating. Every engagement taught lessons that were immediately incorporated into doctrine. Every Japanese tactic was analyzed, countered, and turned into an American advantage. The Marines were learning to fight at night, traditionally a Japanese advantage. They were learning to move silently through the jungle that had seemed impenetrable 2 weeks ago. Most dangerously, they were learning to read Japanese tactics, to anticipate attacks, to turn the enemy's own doctrine against them.
September 12th, 1942. The Marines called it Bloody Ridge, with the grim humor of men who had learned to name their nightmares. Japanese maps designated it Hill 123, a forgettable number for what would become an unforgettable graveyard.
Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson commanded the positions along the ridge with 840 raiders and paramarines, elite troops even by Marine standards. They'd had 5 weeks to learn Guadalcanal's lessons, and every man understood that Japanese doctrine demanded they try again, harder, with more force. They didn't have to wait long. General Kawaguchi Kiyotake's 6,000-man brigade approached through the jungle with confidence born of experience. Unlike Ichiki, Kawaguchi wasn't reckless. He'd studied the American positions, probed their defenses, identified weak points. His assault would be methodical, overwhelming, unstoppable. What Kawaguchi didn't know was that he was walking into a trap designed by men who had spent 5 weeks turning jungle warfare into science. The raiders had done something unprecedented in military history. They'd created a 3-dimensional defense in terrain where conventional doctrine said defense was impossible. They'd cut fields of fire that seemed natural. They'd registered every approach with mortars and machine guns. They'd established fallback positions that channeled attackers into kill zones. And they'd done it all while appearing scattered and vulnerable. Private Joseph Ottoman, positioned in a forward listening post, heard them coming hours before the attack. It wasn't individual soldiers. It was like the jungle itself was moving. Thousands of men trying to be quiet, and you could hear it if you knew what to listen for. We'd learned what to listen for. The attack began at 2100 hours on September 12th with an artillery barrage that would have devastated a European position. Against Marines who'd learned to dig into coral and construct overhead cover, it was merely loud. Then came the infantry assault, wave after wave, executed with the discipline and courage that had conquered half of Asia. And the Marines killed them by the hundreds. What had changed in 5 weeks wasn't American courage. Marines had always been brave. What had changed was methodology. Every position had interlocking fire. Every withdrawal was planned and covered. Every counterattack was coordinated even without radio communication. The Americans had developed a grammar of jungle warfare, and they were speaking it fluently. Sergeant Anthony Palermo described the technique. They'd come screaming up the hill and we'd let them get close, closer than felt safe, closer than training said you should. Then, the machine guns would open up from positions they didn't know existed. Enfilade fire, we called it. Hitting them from the side. They'd go down in rows like someone was cutting grass. Then we'd fall back to the next position and do it again. By midnight, Kawaguchi's assault had stalled. The general committed his reserves, certain that one more push would break through. It didn't. The Marines bent but didn't break, and every Japanese gain was paid for in blood that would make the Ilu River look like a skirmish. At 0400 hours, Kawaguchi ordered withdrawal. Of his 6,000 men, over 1,200 lay dead on the slopes of Bloody Ridge. Another 600 were wounded so badly they couldn't walk. The survivors stumbled back into the jungle, not just defeated, but shattered, psychologically as well as physically. For the first time, Japanese soldiers were experiencing something their doctrine had never prepared them for. They were learning to fear. Captain Tadashi Suzuki, one of the few officers to survive, wrote in his diary, "The Americans fight without honor, but with terrible effectiveness. They do not charge courageously. They kill methodically, like machines. When we attack, they are waiting. When we withdraw, they follow. They do not respect the warrior's way. They respect only results." This was the fundamental disconnect that would doom Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Where Bushido measured success in courage and spirit, American doctrine measured success in enemy casualties versus friendly casualties. Where Japanese tactics prioritized offensive action and aggressive spirit, American tactics prioritized survival and mission accomplishment. One approach was noble. The other was effective. The transformation of Marine Corps doctrine happened with a speed that would have been impossible in peacetime. Every patrol returned with new lessons. Every firefight generated tactical innovations. The original landing force of confused, overloaded troops had evolved into something the jungle had never seen. An apex predator, perfectly adapted to its environment. They learned to move silently through vegetation that had betrayed them in August. They learned to navigate without compasses using terrain features invisible to untrained eyes. They learned to identify Japanese positions by subtle signs: disturbed earth, cut vegetation, the faint smell of Japanese rations. Most importantly, they learned to kill efficiently at night, turning the darkness from a Japanese advantage into an American weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, arriving with the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, brought with him tactics developed from studying both Japanese methods and American failures. His units practiced immediate action drills until they became reflexive. Contact left, half the unit returns fire, half maneuvers to flank. Contact front, suppressive fire, coordinate mortars, assault or withdrawal based on tactical assessment. Every scenario had a response, and every Marine knew it. By October 1942, the Japanese were no longer attacking with confidence. They were attacking with desperation.
October 23, 1942. General Yakutake stood at his command post south of the Matanakau River, watching his last great offensive dissolve into chaos before it had properly begun. The Sendai Division, 17,000 of Japan's finest troops, was supposed to execute a coordinated three-pronged attack that would drive the Americans into the sea. Instead, they were being systematically destroyed by a force one-third their size. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. While one force attacked the American airfield from the south, another would strike from the east, and a third would envelope from the west. Simultaneous pressure from multiple directions would overwhelm American defenses. It had worked in China. It had worked in Malaya. It would work here. Except the Americans weren't defending. They were attacking. Marine commanders had done something that violated Japanese expectations. They'd identified the Japanese assembly areas, calculated the attack routes, and launched preemptive strikes that caught Japanese forces while they were still organizing. It wasn't defensive warfare. It was aggressive, mobile, and it demonstrated something terrifying. The Americans could now fight in the jungle better than the Japanese. Colonel Akinosuke Oka, commanding the Western Attack Force, radioed back reports that Haikutak initially refused to believe. American patrols penetrated our positions before our attack began. They struck our supply dumps, our communications centers, our artillery positions. They knew exactly where to hit. They moved through terrain we thought impassable. General, they fight like us, but with better equipment and better intelligence. This was the culmination of 3 months of brutal adaptation. The Marines had developed a comprehensive system of jungle warfare that integrated every lesson learned since August 7th. Reconnaissance patrols operated continuously, mapping enemy positions and movements. Unlike traditional European reconnaissance that tried to avoid contact, Marine patrols sought contact. Brief, violent engagements that gathered intelligence and disrupted enemy preparations. Sergeant Harry Tully described the technique. We'd hit them at dawn, kill whoever was there, take whatever papers or maps they had, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. Every day, sometimes twice a day. They never knew when we were coming, and they couldn't predict where. Fire support coordination had evolved into an art form. Forward observers attached to every patrol could bring down mortar, artillery, and naval gunfire with accuracy that seemed impossible in jungle terrain. Japanese officers discovered that concentrating troops, necessary for any attack, meant inviting devastating bombardment. Disperse, and you lost coordination. Concentrate, and you died. The Americans had also mastered something the Japanese had never prioritized: logistics. While Japanese soldiers survived on minimal rations and whatever they could forage, Marines received regular resupply of food, ammunition, and medical supplies.
The Japanese viewed this as weakness, dependence on material comfort. In reality, it meant American units could sustain combat operations indefinitely, while Japanese effectiveness degraded from hunger and disease. The three-day battle that followed was less a coherent engagement than a series of meeting encounters where better fed, better supplied, and better coordinated American forces systematically destroyed Japanese units piece by piece. The Sendai Division's carefully planned offensive devolved into desperate charges by starving, exhausted troops against positions that seemed impossible to locate until machine guns opened fire. Private First Class Charles Chuck Tatum, firing a .30 caliber machine gun during one of dozens of defensive stands, later reflected on the mathematics of it. They'd come at us with maybe 50, 60 men. We'd kill 40 of them in the first 2 minutes. The rest would pull back. 30 minutes later, they'd try again. Same result. It wasn't warfare. It was arithmetic. We had the numbers, and the numbers said they'd lose. By October 26th, Haikutak ordered withdrawal. Of the 17,000 troops committed to the offensive, 3,000 lay dead in the jungle. Another 4,000 were so badly wounded or diseased they'd never fight again. The survivors retreated, not in organized formations, but as scattered, starving refugees, pursued by Marine patrols that had learned to track like hunters. Japanese prisoners, rare in the early months because Bushido demanded death over capture, became more common as men chose survival over tradition. Their interrogations revealed something American intelligence had suspected, but now confirmed. Japanese morale was collapsing. One prisoner, a sergeant from the 38th Infantry Division, spoke through translators with an exhaustion that went beyond physical. "We were told Americans were weak, that they couldn't fight in the jungle, that they'd break when faced with Japanese spirit. Every word was a lie. They fight better than we do. They kill more efficiently than we do. They never stop, never rest, never give us time to recover. It's not warfare, it's extermination." The word he used, extermination, would appear repeatedly in Japanese documents from Guadalcanal onward. It wasn't hyperbole. American doctrine had evolved into a system so efficient at killing that it seemed industrial rather than military. The transformation from defensive operations to offensive dominance took exactly 12 weeks. By November 1942, Marines weren't just holding Guadalcanal, they were expanding their perimeter daily, pushing Japanese forces into ever-shrinking pockets with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope. Every day, patrols ventured deeper into Japanese-held territory. Every day, they returned with new intelligence, new tactics, and confirmed kills. The Japanese tried everything. Night infiltration. Marines learned to use tripwires and listening posts that detected movement hours before attacks materialized. Artillery bombardment. Marines dug so deep and built such strong positions that shells that would devastate European forces barely degraded combat effectiveness. Naval bombardment from offshore warships. American radar and counter-battery fire made this suicidal for Japanese vessels. Most desperately, the Japanese tried starvation, gambling that cutting American supply lines would force withdrawal. They didn't understand American logistics capabilities. While Japanese soldiers survived on rice and whatever they could forage, Marines received 5,000 tons of supplies weekly. The Americans ate hot meals, smoked cigarettes, wrote letters home, and fought at full effectiveness. The Japanese ate roots, tree bark, and eventually each other.
December 9, 1942. The decision reached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo wasn't announced publicly, but every Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal felt its weight. Abandon the island. Begin evacuation operations. Accept the unacceptable, Japan's first major defeat of the Pacific War.
But surrender wasn't the Japanese way. The evacuation would be a fighting withdrawal, and more importantly, a testament to Japanese resilience. They would leave, but they would leave with honor, taking as many Americans with them as possible. What the Japanese High Command didn't understand was that by December, the Marines weren't just soldiers anymore. They'd become something the Pacific had never seen. Specialists in jungle warfare who operated with a lethality that seemed almost supernatural. Major Lewis Walt, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, described the transformation. We didn't walk through the jungle anymore. We flowed through it. Every man knew his job so perfectly that we didn't need to talk. Hand signals, small sounds, the way someone moved. We'd developed our own language. The Japanese called us ghosts. They were right. We'd learned to be invisible until we chose to be seen. The patrols that ranged through Japanese-held territory in those final months weren't traditional military operations. They were hunting expeditions. Teams of 6 to 8 Marines would disappear into the jungle for days at a time, living off minimal supplies, moving completely silently, striking Japanese positions at will. Corporal Anthony Palumbo participated in 17 such patrols before Guadalcanal secured. His account, recorded decades later, captured the psychological warfare aspect. We'd hit them at different times every day, dawn one day, noon the next, midnight the day after. They never knew when we were coming. We'd kill a few men, take their supplies, and vanish. Sometimes we'd just watch them, let them know we were there, but not attack. The uncertainty was worse than combat. They stopped sleeping. They stopped eating. They just waited to die. This wasn't the warfare of August 1942, when frightened Marines stumbled through unfamiliar terrain. This was precision violence applied with surgical accuracy by men who'd mastered every aspect of jungle combat. The Americans had developed tactics that exploited every Japanese weakness while negating every Japanese strength. Japanese night operations, once their greatest advantage, became suicide missions. Marines deployed listening posts equipped with sound detectors that could identify approaching troops by their footsteps and breathing. Ambush positions covered every likely approach route with interlocking fires that created kill zones impossible to cross. Private First Class Bill Crumpacker, manning one such position, experienced the evolution personally. First month, we were scared of the dark. The jungle at night terrified us. By December, the Japanese were scared of us. We owned the darkness. We'd hear them coming from 300 yards away. We'd let them get close, real close, close enough to smell them. Then we'd open up and it would be over in seconds. They'd never even see us. The Japanese attempted to counter this by changing their tactics, moving in smaller groups, varying their routes, attempting their own ambush operations. Nothing worked. The Marines had developed an intelligence network that seemed omniscient. Native scouts, coast watchers, and captured documents combined to create a comprehensive picture of Japanese positions and intentions. Every Japanese radio transmission was intercepted and translated within hours. Every movement of troops was observed and reported. Every supply dump, headquarters, and defensive position was mapped with precision that would have required months in conventional warfare. The Americans weren't fighting blind anymore. They were fighting with complete battlefield awareness. Colonel Toshinari Shoji, commanding the rearguard during the evacuation, wrote in his diary, "The Americans know everything. They know where we are, where we're going, how many men we have. We move at night, they're waiting. We move at day, they attack from unexpected directions. Our communications are compromised. Our security is non-existent. Fighting them is like fighting spirits who can see through mountains and trees. This is not warfare. This is extermination. That word again, extermination. It appeared in Japanese documents with increasing frequency because no other term captured the systematic, complete nature of American operations. This wasn't combat between equivalent forces. This was an industrial process of identifying, fixing, and eliminating enemy units with mechanical efficiency. The evacuation itself became a nightmare that lasted from late December 1942 through February 7, 1943. Japanese forces, organized into small units for the withdrawal, had to navigate through territory completely controlled by Marine patrols. Thousands never made it to the evacuation beaches. They died in jungle ambushes, killed by artillery called in by invisible observers, or simply collapsed from starvation and disease. Those who did reach the beaches discovered that even evacuation was contested. American aircraft operating from Henderson Field, the very airfield the Japanese had been trying to recapture, strafed evacuation barges and transport vessels. American artillery, pre-registered on likely evacuation points, pounded the beaches. There was no safety, no respite, only the choice between dying on Guadalcanal or dying on the voyage home. Private First Class Sterling Mace, watching Japanese troops board barges under fire, felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but recognition of what had been created. We'd become killers. Not soldiers, killers. Efficient, emotionless, professional. We'd learned every trick they knew and invented new ones they couldn't counter. Looking at those beaten men trying to escape, I understood that we'd created something that couldn't be stopped. A system for winning that had nothing to do with courage or honor. It was just mathematics. By February 9, 1943, when the last Japanese soldier left Guadalcanal, the transformation was complete. The United States Marine Corps had entered the campaign as an untested force using untested doctrine. They left as the most effective jungle warfare force the world had ever seen. The statistics told part of the story. American casualties, 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded. Japanese casualties, 19,000 killed in action, 1,000 captured. A casualty ratio of nearly 7-to-1. But numbers couldn't capture the psychological transformation. The Japanese military, which had conquered half of Asia through superior fighting spirit and technical excellence, had been systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought with industrial efficiency rather than martial valor.
February 1943. The conference room at Marine Corps Base Quantico held 50 of America's most senior military officers. On the wall hung a large map of the Pacific, pins marking Japanese-held territory from the Aleutians to New Guinea. It was an empire built in 6 months. Now they would discuss how to dismantle it. Major General Vandegrift stood before the assembled officers, no longer the uncertain commander who had landed at Guadalcanal 7 months earlier. He carried with him something more valuable than any weapon, a proven doctrine for winning. "Gentlemen," he began, "Guadalcanal taught us that island warfare is not impossible, it's predictable. Every island follows the same pattern. The Japanese will have numerical advantage initially. They'll have prepared positions. They'll have the advantage of defending familiar terrain. And none of it will matter." He gestured to his operations officer, who began distributing thick manuals, the distilled lessons of 6 months of jungle warfare, codified into doctrine that would guide American operations for the rest of the war. "The Japanese expect us to fight their way," Vandegrift continued. "Courage against courage, spirit against spirit. We won't.
We'll fight the American way. We'll use reconnaissance to find them. We'll use artillery and naval gunfire to destroy their positions. We'll use coordinated infantry to eliminate survivors. And we'll do it repeatedly, methodically, until the island is secure. The manual he distributed would become the template for every amphibious operation from Tarawa to Okinawa. It covered everything: how to conduct beach reconnaissance, how to organize fire support, how to conduct jungle patrols, how to identify and exploit Japanese tactical patterns. Most importantly, it established the principle that would define American island warfare: never fight fair. Use every advantage, the manual stated: naval gunfire, air support, artillery, armor, flame weapons. The enemy values courage and close combat. We value victory and overwhelming firepower. These are not equivalent philosophies. Ours wins wars. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines who'd lived through the transformation understood what they'd created in a way the generals couldn't quite capture. They'd proven that doctrine could defeat tradition, that systematic preparation could overcome superior experience, and that American industrial power, properly applied, was unstoppable. Sergeant Mitchell Page, who'd earned the Medal of Honor on Bloody Ridge, reflected on it years later. People think Guadalcanal was about brave Marines fighting against impossible odds. That's not what happened. What happened was that we figured out a system, a method for taking islands from a determined enemy. Once we had that system, the outcome was never in doubt. It wasn't about courage, it was about process. The Japanese understood this transformation even if they couldn't counter it. Lieutenant General Hiaki Take's final report from Guadalcanal reached Tokyo in March 1943. Buried in pages of tactical analysis was a paragraph that captured the essential truth. The American military does not value individual excellence or martial spirit in the manner of the Imperial Army. Instead, they value systematic cooperation, material advantage, and methodical execution. They've created a form of warfare that emphasizes predictable success over glorious sacrifice. They develop tactics, practice them until perfected, then execute them with mechanical precision. Spirit cannot defeat mathematics. Courage cannot defeat logistics. We must adapt, or we will lose this war. The warning was ignored. Japanese military doctrine, built on centuries of samurai tradition and decades of successful conquest, could not fundamentally change. They would continue fighting with courage, discipline, and tactical skill, and they would continue losing. The island-hopping campaign that followed Guadalcanal followed the pattern established in those first terrible months. At Tarawa, Marines stormed beaches with overwhelming fire support. At Saipan, they systematically reduced Japanese positions with coordinated infantry artillery teams. At Peleliu and Iwo Jima, they adapted to cave defenses with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Every island was different, but the method was always the same: find them, fix them, destroy them, move on. Private Eugene Sledge, who'd fight through Peleliu and Okinawa after missing Guadalcanal, described the evolution. By the time I entered combat, the Corps had it down to a science. You could practically predict every phase of the battle before it happened: landing, securing the beach, advancing inland, reducing strong points, securing the objective. The Japanese fought hard. They always fought hard, but they were fighting against a system that had accounted for every variable. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was cumulative and devastating. Soldiers who'd once approached battle with confidence now approached with dread. The Americans weren't just better equipped, they were better at everything. Better reconnaissance, better fire support, better small unit tactics, better logistics, better medical care, better intelligence. The only advantage the Japanese retained was willingness to die, and that advantage meant nothing against an enemy that specialized in granting that wish efficiently. By 1944, Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved into a grim acceptance of inevitable defeat. The strategy became one of attrition. Make the Americans pay such a high price for each island that public opinion would force negotiation. It didn't work. American industrial production replaced losses faster than combat generated them. Fresh divisions arrived in the Pacific every month. Naval vessels appeared in numbers that seemed impossible. Aircraft filled the skies in formations that blocked out the sun. More importantly, American casualty ratios kept improving. The lessons of Guadalcanal, refined through dozens of subsequent operations, meant that American forces took islands with fewer losses each time. The learning curve that had cost 1,600 Marine lives on Guadalcanal saved tens of thousands of lives on later islands because the doctrine was perfected. In Japanese prisoner-of-war camps, captured soldiers spoke of American warfare with something approaching awe. Corporal Tadamichi Kuribayashi, captured on Iwo Jima, told his interrogators, "We were told that Americans were soft, that they valued life too much to win. This was true, but we misunderstood what it meant. Because they value life, they developed methods to win with minimum casualties. They use machines where we use men. They use coordination where we use courage. They win because they've created a system where individual sacrifice is minimized and collective effectiveness is maximized. This is not weakness. This is intelligence we lack." The surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, represented the final validation of the doctrine born on Guadalcanal. The Japanese military, which had conquered an empire through superior tactics and fighting spirit, had been systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought with industrial logic. General Douglas MacArthur, accepting the surrender, understood what the ceremony represented. The destructive power of modern warfare, when directed by scientific principles and unlimited industrial capacity, has rendered obsolete the martial traditions of centuries. Today ends not just a war, but a philosophy of warfare.
The veterans who returned from Guadalcanal carried with them something that couldn't be seen in victory parades or captured in photographs. They've been part of a transformation in warfare that few civilians could understand. Robert Leckie, who would write about his experiences in Helmet for My Pillow, tried to explain it decades later. People think we won because we were braver or tougher than the Japanese. That's not true. They were brave, incredibly brave. They were tough, impossibly tough. We won because we learned faster, adapted better, and applied resources more efficiently. We turned warfare into engineering. And once you do that, the outcome is determined by production capacity, not courage. The reunion in 1982, 40 years after the landing, brought together American and Japanese veterans at Guadalcanal. The conversations that occurred on those beaches, where thousands had died, were remarkable for their mutual recognition. Sergeant Yukichi Yamamoto, who'd fought with the Sendai Division and survived the evacuation, spoke through a translator to Sergeant Mitchell Page. "In 1942, we thought you were weak. We learned we were wrong. But what we didn't understand until much later was that you weren't just stronger, you were smarter. You created a science of winning that had nothing to do with traditional warfare. We were samurai facing engineers. The samurai never had a chance." Page's response captured the essential truth. We didn't want to be warriors. We wanted to go home. So we developed the fastest, most efficient method for winning so we could do exactly that. You fought to die with honor. We fought to live with victory. Those aren't compatible philosophies in warfare. The doctrine developed at Guadalcanal didn't end with World War II. It evolved into modern amphibious warfare doctrine, expeditionary operations theory, and eventually joint force operations. Every Marine who lands on a contested beach, every joint operation that coordinates air, naval, and ground forces, every military doctrine that emphasizes systematic preparation over individual heroism, all of it traces back to those 6 months when frightened young Americans learned to turn jungle warfare into science. The jungle that had laughed at clumsy Americans in August 1942 belonged to those same Americans by February 1943.
The Japanese troops who'd mocked the Marine landings learned to fear the sound of American patrols moving through darkness. The doctrine that seemed impossible, taking fortified islands from a fanatical enemy, became routine. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, who had laughed at the frightened cattle landing at Guadalcanal, never lived to see how completely wrong he had been. He died by his own hand on the banks of the Ailu River, unable to accept that superior fighting spirit had been defeated by superior methodology. The P-47 Thunderbolt had taught the Luftwaffe that concentrated firepower defeated agility. The Marine Corps had taught the Imperial Japanese Army that systematic warfare defeated martial tradition. Both lessons carried the same fundamental truth. In modern warfare, the side that turns combat into science defeats the side that treats it as art. The Marines who learned that lesson in Guadalcanal's jungles paid for it with blood, terror, and transformation. They entered as soldiers defending against superior enemies. They left as specialists in a form of warfare the world had never seen. The Japanese had been right about one thing. The Americans didn't fight with honor, not in the samurai sense. They fought with something more devastating, efficiency. And in the brutal mathematics of total war, efficiency always wins. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.